There's an old belief here in Essex that this church tower keeps the numbers of witches in the village at 6. When one of them dies, a stone is said to fall from the tower, and another woman takes her place, so the cycle begins again. Each witch can die and be replaced, while the number always stays at 6. According to the legend, that will continue for as long as this tower stands. It sounds like the perfect ghost story, but when we look at where it all began, we find one woman who was accused of killing a child through witchcraft. That woman was found not guilty. So how does one acquitted woman become 6 witches who can never disappear? Hello everyone, today I'm in Canewdon, Essex. It is a small village with a pub, houses along the high street and fields stretching out in almost every direction. And standing over all of it is this. This is St. Nicholas Church, and as you might notice, the tower is enormous for a village this size. You can see it as you're driving in, right on top of the hill. Well, when I think of Witches' Village, I usually think of Burley, but Canewdon has a very particular story. According to local folklore, there must always be 6 witches living somewhere in Canewdon, and as long as that tower remains standing, the number can never be broken. So why 6 witches, and why is the story connected to a Christian church tower? And how this quiet corner of Essex ended up with one of the strangest witchcraft stories in England? Well, this is what we're here to find out. Before we talk about the witches, let's have a look at the building that keeps appearing throughout their story. Canewdon sits on a hill above the Marshes and the Crouch estuary, and isn't especially high by normal standards, but this part of Essex is so flat that the tower dominates the landscape anyway. The church itself is medieval, with the nave and chancel dating from the 14th century and the tower from the early 15th century. It was visible enough that ships travelling along the River Crouch used it as a landmark during the reign of Elizabeth I. So for centuries people could look up and see the church standing above the village. And sadly, this is closed. None of this tells us why there should be 6 witches living beneath it. For that, we need to go back more than 400 years. And we begin with a woman named Rose Pye. She was described as a spinster in a record, and she was accused of using witchcraft against Joan Snow, who was the 1-year-old daughter of a local tailor who, according to the indictment, fell ill and died. It was an awful accusation, and in 16th century England, potentially a deadly one. In July 1580, Rose Pye of Canewdon stood before the Assizes at Chelmsford, and she pleaded not guilty, and the court found her not guilty. She was acquitted. The surviving record is clear on that. Whatever people in Canewdon may have believed about her, the court did not convict Rose of witchcraft or of causing the child's death. It seems like a sensible decision. You will also find another ending to her story. This is where she was found not guilty, she was acquitted, however she didn't have enough money for her release and died in jail several weeks later. I find this claim actually repeated everywhere, but I couldn't find it in the existing Assizes record. But I'm not going to turn it into fact simply because, yeah, it's a good ending. With 6 witches. Okay, it's only me here. I can, maybe a branch broke. Did a branch snap? But that made me jump. Okay. But from then on, Canewdon would become associated with 6 witches. Now, Rose's case happened decades before Matthew Hopkins, the self-appointed witchfinder general, who became one of the most notorious figures in the English witch trials. And by the 1640s, Essex was at the centre of one of the worst witch panics in English history. At the Essex Assizes in July 1645, 36 women were tried for witchcraft. 19 were executed, 9 died in prison, and others remained imprisoned for years. So for people living through it, an accusation of witchcraft would probably end your life. Canewdon seems to have escaped the worst. Matthew Hopkins himself allegedly didn't dare come to Canewdon because he was frightened of the witches here. Some versions go even further and claim Parliament warned him to stay away, and so he did. Rose Pye's name didn't disappear, other names appeared, and between the real accusation from 1580 till now, the number of witches became very specific. There is no document telling us this is the day Canewdon got 6 witches, and Rose Pye court records does not mention them at all. What we have is a real accusation in 1580 and a tradition that says that there are always 6 witches in the village. The story divides them into 3 of cotton and 3 of silk. The usual explanation is that the cotton ones come from a poorer side of the village, and the silk ones come from the richer part of the village. So the question is, what happened when one of them died? Well, that brings us back to the tower. I do sound like a broken record, but according to the best version of the story, whenever one of the Canewdon's witches dies, a stone falls from the tower of St. Nicholas Church, and another woman immediately takes her place, keeping the number at 6. So the witches are actually mortal, it's just the number that carries on, and nobody gets to decide if the replacement actually wants the job. Now, the story does not tell us how she's chosen, who chooses her, or even whether she knows that she has suddenly become one of the 6. And according to the legend, that will continue for as long as the tower remains standing. Of course, this is a medieval tower, so stones fall, you can actually see it where other stones have been added. In Canewdon, though, a fallen stone came with a much stranger explanation. Then, in the 19th century, George Pickingill enters the story. Everybody seems to have known him as Old George, and he was a real person who lived and worked in and around Canewdon, and locals also knew him as a cunning man. People visited cunning folk for charms, cures, finding lost things, and for protection against witchcraft. But according to the stories told about George, he could control animals, cure minor illnesses, and find things that had disappeared. And people were giving him food and drink because of what could happen if they refused. The stories about Old George continued to grow and eventually became known as the master of the Canewdon witches. So the number of witches he controlled, it depends on the story. Sometimes it was 6, sometimes it was 7, sometimes it was 9. So you see that the story about having always 6 witches in Canewdon is having a little problem. He was said to be able to summon the witches using a wooden whistle, while another version claimed he could make them appear in the doorways of the homes so that he could see who they were. And probably in the most dramatic stories of them all, he could make them appear here in the churchyard and make them dance for him. These stories were being told here in this village and around this church, and much of what we know now comes from the folklorist Eric Maple, who interviewed local people and published The Witches of Canewdon in 1960. Later stories linked George to hereditary witchcraft, secret covens, modern Wicca, and some of the biggest names in 20th century occultism. And those later claims are a little bit more controversial. George Pickingill was real, and he works as a farmhand, and he was a cunning man, but all the other stories came later. Old George was buried here,
People sometimes point to this large tomb and say it's George's. Well, it isn't. It's Robert Tabram's.
See, this is why people do not like visitors, and you're making my job so much more difficult.
Pickingill was buried somewhere here in 1909, but where his grave is, no one seems to know anymore.
I wonder which one is George's. Some versions of the Canewdon story say you could encounter the witches by walking around St. Nicholas Church, usually at night and usually anti-clockwise. And apparently you had to get the number of circuits absolutely right. Circling the church could summon a witch, summon the devil, reveal a ghost, or even interfere with time itself. And the required number changes according to the story. If you run 3 times backwards around the church, the spirit of the witches will appear above you. Well, it's not very flat, so don't try this at home, kids. If you walk around this 7 times on Halloween, you might see a witch. And if you manage 13 circuits, apparently you become invisible. One is that you get really clear instructions. So you come here at midnight, you walk the wrong way around a church, you do it the correct number of times, and then you wait and see what happens. It's part ghost story and part there. And no, I'm not going to run around the churchyard 13 times at midnight. It's, it's a churchyard. There's people buried here. Plenty of people, however, have apparently come here willing to try it. Color me surprised. Now, there are ghost stories around the churchyard as well. One of them is the Grey Lady, moving away from the churchyard and sometimes towards the River Crouch. Some versions call her the ghost of a witch, although who she was when she lived or why she is supposedly still here is much more or less clear. And then there is another figure, one that is considerably less polite. Some versions say it's headless, while others say it's faceless, and it supposedly appears near the church, grabs people and throws them into a ditch. Well, that is basically the entire haunting. There's no message, no identity. It's just a random dude who grabs people and throws them into ditches. Fair enough. Maybe they are all complete different stories, and maybe they're the same stories woven together by time. Who can tell? Canewdon's witch stories were also part of ordinary village life. If a cart suddenly refused to move, for example, people might simply blame a witch. As carts disappeared, the stories moved to flat bicycle tires, issues with car tires, parked here just outside the church, so if I have issues, we know who to blame. Well, I love that story because apparently the witch is happy to keep up with modern transport. Eventually, Canewdon's reputation started bringing people here, especially on Halloween, but people would come here and look for witches and ghosts. Not everybody treated the church particularly well, and there were some occasions during the years when access around the church was reportedly restricted because of the number of visitors and the behavior of some of the people who came here. There is a huge difference between exploring a strange story and coming here thrashing the place just because we find it spooky. So, where did the story of the 6 witches come from? Well, there isn't a neat answer. None of this seemed to have arrived all at once, and here we are 450 years later, after Rose Pye was acquitted, still standing here talking about witches. And to be the party pooper, there's actually no evidence that 6 witches actually lived in Canewdon. Well, you guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please give us a thumb up, and I shall see you in the next one. And if you did enjoy this video and you'd like to know more about the witches' trials, Matthew Hopkins, etc., link to the next video here.